Hello and welcome to Mondays at Mount Olive for March 10th, 2025, the first Monday in the season of Lent. Happy Monday. I'm Pastor Dan Torkelson, Senior Pastor of Mount Olive Lutheran Church here in Madison, Wisconsin. We just went through the spring ahead time change. I don't know how you feel about those things. How do you feel about daylight savings time? Always seems like an interesting discussion. Just heard this week, actually it was from the president, that it's kind of a 50-50 divide apparently in polling, but it seems like the opinions are not middle of the road on either side of that. So maybe best to leave well enough alone. I don't know. I don't think I would mind whatever change might or might not be in store for the future with regard to that. How well do you physically react to it? We know, especially with the spring one, this loss of an hour, that there is usually an increase in certain medical issues. In fact, last year when I got sick, it was only within about 2.5 weeks of the change, and there was some thought in my mind that maybe some of that had to do with that. I don't think it did, but at the end of the day, I've even had friends going to the hospital after this change, and most likely it was tied to it in one way or another. I tend to do pretty well with spring ahead, truthfully, better than I do with the fall back. I usually have a little bit better energy through spring ahead. I work through it faster. I'll have a couple of weeks of tired after the fall back thing. I don't know what that's all about. And this year I actually just a few days ago started taking vitamin D again too, after taking time off from it when I started on insulin, and that was noticeable. There was a noticeable difference. In fact, that kind of accounts for some of the jokes I was telling yesterday in Bible study about just how with it I was yesterday, which was a little scary. I mean, everything ran like clockwork yesterday. And by the way, we've come off two really beautiful services in a row. One was the evening Ash Wednesday service, and the other was yesterday. And there are two of the finest services I think I've had the chance to do here yet. And like I said in the Gratitudes, you have a lot to do with that. Your singing, your involvement, your being there, your presence in God's presence on Sunday morning is a big part of what makes a beautiful service a beautiful service. And I'm just really happy with the way things are going right now here at Mount Olive, just in general. The mood is good, and a lot of wonderful things are starting to take real shape here, and I'm just excited about it. I think the future looks marvelous, and I hope you can be along for that wonderful ride. It was the first Sunday in Lent, and Lent is a great season. It's a great season. It's a very focus season. The weeks of Lent have their particular focuses. Actually, all the weeks of the church year do, but I've always found that Lents are very narrow. And as I've gotten older and I've been in the ministry longer, I've found that those weeks mean a lot. I mean, they are just so much better for preaching than a more undisciplined week like you get in summer and things like that. In Lent, you just have your topic. And I kind of got out of the gate fast in the sermon yesterday on the whole notion of in Lent, it does all come down to one. It comes down to the mano a mano between Jesus and the devil. And actually, on this first Sunday in Lent, it's about the mano a mano between us and the devil as well. And so we kick things off traditionally first Sunday in Lent with the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. To kind of break this down, I think I'm just going to go at sort of the basic things right up front. If you want to know when does a temptation take place, it takes place right after Jesus' baptism, at the very outset of his public ministry. You know, it's sort of well known that his public ministry occurred between ages 30 and his death and resurrection at the age of 33. So he's right at the start of the public ministry. The public ministry begins in the waters of the Jordan in his baptism, but then it goes straight from there into the wilderness where Jesus is going to be tempted. So the location, so the time of it is at the beginning of his ministry. The location is in the wilderness, and the Just the term wilderness invokes a rather rich symbolism in the Bible. It's very powerfully symbolic. Jesus goes into the wilderness to navigate the wilderness in a way that Israel was not able to navigate it. They would eventually navigate it only under the leadership of God. That was the only way it was going to happen. And one generation, as I mentioned yesterday, died there on the floor of the wilderness for their failure to follow God into the promised land when they got there the first time. The wilderness as a symbol works beautifully for life in a fallen world. In fact, that's a big part of how you preach this, how you understand it, especially in the Lenten season, in the first Sunday in Lent. We live in a fallen world, and for that reason, we are subject to temptation all the time. Let's talk a little bit about how this begins. It begins with Jesus taking 40 days of fasting. It would appear that the devil appears at the end of those 40 days when Jesus is at his weakest. Fasting, as you well know, has dangers and benefits. Short-range fasting can be remarkable. I've played around with what they call intermittent fasting as something of a tactic for working with my blood sugars before I was on significant medicine for it, and it worked for a long time. It was actually quite successful. 4 days a week, I would go on an 18-hour fast, which would basically begin at supper time the night before and extend all the way to 1 or 2 in the afternoon the next day. I wouldn't eat anything. And the benefit of that fasting was not just for my blood sugars. The interesting thing about intermittent fasting is that it also it weirdly energizes and focuses you as well. It's got some great blessings, but too much fasting, or fasting if your body is just not wired right for it, of course, can be very, very bad. Jesus is at the end of 40 days of fasting, and I don't think we should call it a hard fast. He'd be dead if it was a hard fast. There had to be some sort of sustenance there, at least water. I don't know if he had... It doesn't appear that he had a lot of food around, so I won't even speculate how that worked. But I'm guessing he would have had to have water, because at about 2 weeks he'd have been dead without the water. 40 days of fasting is far more dangerous, and it certainly would make any one of us much more susceptible to temptation if the devil showed up. So this is an interesting confrontation between a human son of God and the devil. And there's a couple of interesting connections between this story and 2 other stories. I've already mentioned one of them, and that is Israel in the wilderness. There's a powerful connection there. But the first temptation to turn stones into bread is a remarkable echo of the first ever temptation in Genesis 3, the devil's temptation of Eve to eat the delicious-looking fruit of the tree she was commanded not to eat from, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so what's the whole point? What is the whole point of the temptation of Jesus? Jesus' baptism at the end of chapter 3 sets the stage for the whole point. At his baptism, God the Father announces publicly that Jesus is his son, the one that he has chosen to save the world. And immediately then, Jesus is driven into the wilderness as his first step toward the cross. The temptation sets the mission to defeat the devil once and for all. That's the mission. Jesus' mission is to win salvation for us, to defeat the devil once and for all. The 3 temptations themselves, quite interestingly, mirror what you heard me call the unholy trinity. The stones to bread, the first temptation, mirrors the sinful flesh. It's a sinful flesh temptation, feeding your gut, feeding your stomach. The second temptation, taking up to a high place and showing him all the nations of the world, that's a world temptation. Power, wealth, those sorts of things fall under the world. And the last one, I'm going to call it temple diving. That's the devil himself. The devil's final end game is to get a person to quit believing in God. And there's no more symbolic or powerful way to get that done, to get him to quite literally jump from the temple, from God's holy house. And I wanted to at this point kind of bring us back around to really the beauty of this story. A number of you commented with me yesterday about how you'd never heard temptation talked about that way before. I kind of beg to differ. I think you have, you probably just haven't realized it. It took me a long time to really settle on the fact that the temptation is not a close competition. It's not, Jesus doesn't win with a last second field goal or a walk-off home run. The temptation, and indeed his entire battle with the devil, all the way to his death when he said, "It is finished," is basically a no-hitter. Jesus pitches a no-hitter and the devil loses. The devil never stood a chance. You heard me talk about the qualities of different temptations. You could probably imagine that first temptation being difficult, but the second one is utterly silly. The idea that Satan controls the nations and he can give them to Jesus when it's Jesus who controls the nations and could give them to anyone he wanted to, is just absolutely silly. And the notion that Jesus would jump from his Father's house, that he would test Psalm 91 about the angels making sure you don't strike your foot against a stone, is just, again, it's maybe not quite as silly as the second temptation, but from Jesus's perspective, this just ain't going to happen. But in talking about this as a rout, that's, by the way, that's Luther's favorite term to describe Jesus's battle with the devil. The devil was routed. He was destroyed. He was just, this was 77-0. This was a no-hitter. It was, I'll come up with whatever analogy you want. It was not close. What that leads to is something we sang about before the sermon, and that comment that people were making yesterday along the lines of, "Pastor, I'd never heard temptation talked about like this before." Oh yeah, I think you have. In fact, you've probably, if you're a lifelong Lutheran, you've sung about it many times before. The hymn of the day for Lent 1 is the hymn of the day for Reformation Day, and that is "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," Luther's great hymn. And I want to point your attention to stanza 3 of "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." You're going to see it up on the screen. "Though devils all the world should fill, all eager to devour us, we tremble not, we fear no ill. They shall not overpower us. This world's prince may still scowl fierce as he will. He can harm us none, he's judged, the deed is done. One little word can fell him." Look at that confidence. Wow. I mean, I have the whole hymn memorized. I think if you're a Lutheran and don't love this hymn, you're you should maybe go get some help. But come talk to me. But in the bigger picture, that stanza, it just sticks out. It kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. Because Jesus has routed the devil, because the devil never stood a chance, because this was a no-hitter from the get-go. Let's call it a perfect game no-hitter. 27 batters, they all go down. Let's just realize that what that means for us is that we can have a confidence in the face of temptation. Obviously, we've got a sinful nature, and obviously every day we are going to give in to temptation. But a lot of times the reason we do is tied to this weird fear that Luther is just putting to death in this stanza here. We tremble not, we fear no ill. They shall not overpower us. And I mentioned Jesus's promise to the disciples after the ascending of the 72 in Luke chapter 10. He says, "Nothing will harm you. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven," which is probably a reference to Satan's defeat in the quote-unquote war in heaven, which again, I don't think took very long. Archangel Michael threw him. And what I think we often forget is we forget that, one, he threw him to earth, which was already in existence. And two, Jesus seeing him fall like lightning from heaven. It's important to remember that the devil wanders around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour, like it says in 1 Peter. He's real. That's a very, very real thing. But for those of us who are in Christ and who already have that victory, live in the victory. And when the temptations strike, tell the devil where he can go. What I think has happened is we've done something with heaven and hell and our kind of common understandings of them that actually have hurt us in some ways. We imagine heaven being very far away, which scriptures don't necessarily say. In the scriptures, I heard it described by one of my old profs as heaven as Earth's control room. Well, if you think of like a newsroom control room, that's not far away at all. That's, visible contact with Earth. So we shouldn't imagine Jesus far away. We shouldn't imagine heaven far away. We also do the same thing with hell, and then we put Satan there as if he's not a problem here. In Job, at the beginning of Job, God says, God has this meeting of the archangels, and Satan shows up for it because that's what he was. And God asks him, so where you been? And Satan's answer is, walking to and fro on earth. He thinks he runs the place, which is why he's called in this stanza and in many places in theology, this world's prince. That's the devil. He thinks he runs this place. That's what he tried to get across in the dumbest of the three temptations of Jesus, is that, I got control of this place. This place is mine. And Jesus says, no, it's not. It belongs to me. And that one, I think he dispatches that one the most easily of all. And it helps to live in the victory of Christ, especially in the face of temptation. When temptation strikes, you can look the devil in the eye and tell him where to go. It's as simple as that. A mighty fortress has been telling you that your entire life. You can have more confidence in the face of temptation than you sometimes think. Let's get on to Daniel chapter 8. I don't have any images for this. It's interesting. If you go looking for images of Daniel online, especially stock images that I can use here, like with the little panels you've seen in the last videos, with attributions and things like that, it's very, very hard to find any images for Daniel 8 to the end of Daniel. The last one that I was able to find images for was last week's Daniel 7. So you're not going to see images. I am going to put the text on the screen for you, and we're going to kind of rifle through the first three sections of it. And when you see the text on the screen, you're going to notice that I underlined a number of things, and those are the things I plan to comment about. But I'm just quickly read you through the underlined things. The second vision, and it's not a dream anymore, it's an actual vision, takes place during the reign of King Belshazzar during the third year of it, which is to say 2 years after the vision we talked about last week in Daniel 7. He saw in the vision that he had been transferred to Susa, the citadel in the province of Elam, which is in the eastern part of the Persian Empire. You could imagine this being a little bit closer to like the modern day Tehran. This is where he sees the vision. What he sees in the vision is he sees a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It has two horns. One is higher than the other. That's a discipline, or that is a detail worth noting. The ram charged westward, northward, and southward, and no beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. The next section of the vision talks about another beast that comes along. That beast was a male goat who came from the west, and he came across the face of the whole earth. He had one conspicuous horn. That's a detail we'll talk a little bit about. And he came up to the ram with the two horns and charged it, and charged it hard enough that he broke the two horns of the ram, and the ram lost all of his power. And then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, that great horn eventually was broken, and instead up came four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. And the last part of the actual vision, the vision also includes the interpretation, by the way, which I'm holding that off. Like I said last week, don't rush to interpret too quickly. But the interpretation we're going to get is kind of a combination of what the Bible, what the vision, what Daniel was told in the vision, and some of the other things that we can see from the benefit of history, quite interestingly. Out of one of those four horns came a little horn, and that we had that language in the last vision, the little horn that couldn't stop talking and was boasting. a little horn which became exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land, which is Palestine. It grew great even to the host of heaven. It knocked off the host and some of the stars. It was as great for a time as the prince of the host. It overthrew the sanctuary, and it even threw truth to the ground for a time. And then a holy one spoke and asked the question, how long is the vision concerning this desecration of the sanctuary? And the answer is 2,300 evenings and mornings. And we'll get to that too. But let's rewind and let's kind of talk our way through the interpretation. Daniel will then get an interpretation. He'll get an interpretation from Gabriel, the angel Gabriel. And that's remarkable. Gabriel, the archangels are kind of known for being the sort of direct messengers from God. And Gabriel probably has some of the most important messages ever given, most notably the message to Mary that she was going to have a child, and that child is going to be the Son of God, the Messiah, in Luke chapter 1. That's Gabriel 2. And anyway, let's kind of get into the details. First of all, third year of the reign of King Belshazzar is when this takes place. That's 2 years after the vision in Daniel 7. And my guess is it sort of feels when you see Daniel's reaction to this vision, that he still hasn't even really processed the first one in Daniel 7, even though 2 years have gone by. All of this is out in the future. He's been given this information, but you have to excuse him for not understanding it, and you kind of have to excuse him also for not being comforted by it, which I mentioned last week as well. The ram has two horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And higher in this case means also more important. The ram is referring to the Medo-Persian Empire, which was an interesting experiment in history of two empires kind of coming together. The Empire of Media, Medea, and Persia. Now, Persia was the bigger empire. It was a much bigger empire. And in all honesty, it looks to me at that ancient history seems to reveal that Persia pretty much controls this empire. And so it is the higher horn of the two horns. But the two horns do represent the two empires. And then the ram charges westward, northward, and southward. And that is how this empire expands. It expands from the east. It's coming basically from Persia in the east. That's modern-day Iran. And it's spreading westward, northward, and southward. And so interestingly, these details, this particular vision isn't that hard, really not that hard to interpret. It's interesting. The details are backed up by history too. Interestingly, there's a historical fulfillment of this prediction, while at the same time, it has a relevance for the last days, and that is how prophecy works. But anyway, Daniel 8, again, moving on to verse 5, as I was considering, behold, a male goat comes from the west. So, okay, they're charging to the east, the Medo-Persians, they're charging to the west. But out in the west is this other goat with one conspicuous horn. He's charging eastward. So you see a collision coming. That's the idea here. And the male goat has one conspicuous horn. This is a reference to Greece at the height of its powers. And the one conspicuous horn is likely a biblical reference to Alexander the Great in particular, which was Greece's highest point as an empire. I compared Alexander the Great's role in Greek history to that of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus in Roman history. These are the high points of Roman history. Rome will never be what it was under Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus again, after Augustus dies in particular. Alexander the Great charges to the east, which is what he does, and he smashes the Medo-Persian Empire, which is what he does. Breaks the two horns. That's one of the details a little bit lower down on the screen there. And then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Interestingly, the Greek Empire divided four ways, and so it says here, instead of the one horn, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven, and that happened to the Greek Empire. And that development winds up setting up the scary part of the vision, which starts at verse 9. A little horn grows out of the four conspicuous horns. And this was true in Daniel 7. There was a little horn in Daniel 7 as well. The little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes, about 168 BC. The name Epiphanes means manifestation, and Antiochus was the emperor of one of the corners, the four corners of the Greek Empire, known as Seleucia. He was a Seleucid emperor. And the word Epiphanes means manifestation. He had a very unhealthily high level of self-esteem. He wanted people to think he was God himself. He was the Epiphanes. He was the manifestation of God, God in human form. And he did become very powerful. He wanted to conquer Egypt. Palestine's on the way. He runs through Palestine once, gets down to Egypt. He's stopped by the Romans. That's kind of a fun little development. Rome is developing at this point, and he gets right down to Egypt, and there's a Roman ship waiting for him out in the Mediterranean Sea. They send an emissary who tells Epiphanes, "You attack Egypt, and we're going to destroy you." And Epiphanes says, and so make your decision. And Epiphanes is sort of like, well, okay, give me 3 weeks and I'll let you know. And they said, no, you have till tomorrow. And if you don't, and if you decide not to, we're coming for you right now. And Antiochus wisely figures Rome is stronger than he is, and he backs off. And he's very, very mad. It's a scorched earth policy back through Palestine as he heads back home, back up to the north and to the west. But anyway, long story short, that is the story. Along the way, while he's in Palestine, he desecrates the temple. That's all that other symbolism about the place of the sanctuary being overthrown. He roasts a pig on the altar of the temple. It's very, very disrespectful. It's not a very nice thing. And at the end of the day, there is this a number finally at the end of the first part of the vision. When asked how long will the desecration of the temple be in place, 2,300 evenings and mornings. 2,300 divided by 365 is about 6.31 years. And I don't know how they calculated years. I'm sure someone does, but I don't seem to recall. I'm sure I was taught it at one time. I don't know. It might be the same way we did. It might not a way we do. It might not be. I don't know. The number should not be viewed literally. Hardly any numbers in apocalyptic are literal. It's very important to understand that they're symbolic. So 2,300 evenings and mornings should, by and large, be the comforting part of of this vision, because at the end of the day, you see that time is limited. It's not. God does not tolerate this forever. He puts everything on his timeline. Important to remember the historical meaning. There's a historical fulfillment of this in round about 168 AD. 4 years later, Epiphanes, or BC, I should say, 4 years later, Epiphanes dies, and so that's probably your 2,300. At that point, Israel, Palestine becomes really slowly sucked into the Roman Empire. And the Romans take a sort of magnanimous view early on to religion. They just, we're not going to get into it. We'll let them believe whatever they want to believe. It was kind of low key for a long time until Christianity really starts to take off, and then it starts to become a problem. Go take a look at Nero, for instance. I won't go there now. It's comforting to us, first of all, because there is a historical fulfillment of this vision. 2, it should be comforting to help us realize that God puts limits on time. Time belongs to him, and he puts limits on it. And 2, everything is restored, and Jesus comes along and says, yeah, and renewed as well. And God's people are always kind of under God's protection in all of this. The visions don't tell us that, people are dying. Not that they won't, but if your bags are packed, your bags are packed. Let's move on. I wanted to talk about one last topic before we go, and that is a topic that kind of comes up this time of year, especially as we transition into the season of Lent. And it's a topic that it's a significant part of our Lutheran theology, and I worry we're not saying it enough. I've worried about that for a long time. It's the other side of being forgiven. And the other side of being forgiven is called freedom. The freedom of the gospel. Paul's Paul's most exhaustive treatment of this is the book of Galatians. The book of Galatians is often referred to as the epistle of Christian freedom. And in chapter 5, he's just like, stand firm in the freedom with which Christ has set you free, and don't become a slave again to the law and that sort of thing. The reality is, the freedom of the Bible, the freedom that Jesus talks about when he talks about the truth will set you free, it's not the same as the freedom of the U.S. Constitution. And this is a problem we have in America. In America, we sometimes confuse these things, and we shouldn't. This is different. This is a freedom that is tied to the forgiveness of sins. It is the freedom that we have because God has declared us not guilty. That word justification that we Lutherans are so big on, that's what that means. That's the forensic act that God says, where he takes our sins and says, not guilty. But what does that mean? Psalm 103, verse 12, as far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. Listen to that language for just a second. Those two words, from us. When God forgives sins, he's not just saying it doesn't matter to me anymore. He's saying, because I've declared it not guilty, you're free. You get to go. You're not free now to do whatever you want to do, but you're free to go out into life with a good conscience and to face down the devil and be confident, like we talked about earlier, and do all of that. And the reason this comes up in the season of Lent is because you're well aware that Catholics do a lot of fasting this time of year, certain type of fasting. By the way, the whole fish fry phenomenon here in Wisconsin has pretty much got a Catholic origin. I don't know if you know that. But anyway, long story, I like fish fries, so, fine. That's a good thing. But when we talk about giving things up for Lent, the Lutheran attitude toward it is actually a little surprising, and that's because it's tied to the freedom of the gospel. The Lutheran attitude toward disciplines like fasting or giving things up in general is not that they are bad and forbidden. It's that they could be good, but that you have this freedom now in the forgiveness of sins. The discipline might be a good thing for you to do, or you have the freedom not to. That's fine. I remember I started to wrestle with this when I was a freshman in college, and I had friends, Lutherans who grew up in other Lutheran churches, who had already in high school been giving things up every now and then during Lent, and they got me kind of convinced that I'd try it. So I tried it with, you're going to laugh, I tried it with table salt. I was a table salt addict. I was one who always grabbed the table salt, and it was always spreading on my food. So for 40 days, I gave up table salt. And it wasn't all that hard, in all honesty, but I will tell you one thing, and it was an important lesson I learned, and that is that after the 40 days are over, I quit grabbing table salt altogether. I'm not a table salt guy now. I love all sorts of other seasonings. I found out that I have a very developed palate, and I can pull notes from wine and other things, and I've been blessed with that, and it makes eating and drinking things enjoyable to me, just in general. Not everybody's got the kind of palate that I've got. I can't roll my tongue, and I've been told that that's a sign of someone with a stronger palate. But anyway, long story short, I don't give things up every year. I remember one year I gave up coffee and I was miserable for 40 days. I really did feel like I was suffering along with Jesus, and that's very vain. I understand that. It was vain to think that way, but I was miserable during that one. And I would just simply tell you, if you have a pet sin that you'd like to do something about, this is a great time of year to address it. I have never commanded anyone to give anything up, but sometimes if I'm counseling someone and I know they're struggling with something and Lent is approaching, I have recommended it without commanding it. I've said, maybe you should try this. It's not a bad thing. In the Small Catechism, I'm putting this up on the screen, Luther, talking about preparation for the Lord's Supper, he says, who receives this sacrament worthily? And he starts with this interesting sentence: fasting and bodily preparation are certainly fine outward training. He doesn't condemn fasting before going to the sacrament. He says, but the person who's truly worthy and well prepared is not the person who fasted. The person who's truly worthy and well prepared is the person who believes the words of Christ, that it is his body and blood for them, for the forgiveness of their sins. Like I said, we Lutherans have maybe not preached this enough or well enough, I think, in recent years. And it's been something I think in the past I've maybe highlighted more than I currently am because it is too easy to get wrong. As Christians, what are we free from? We are free from sin, death, and the power of the devil. So you can go ahead and punch the devil in the face. You can go ahead and tell him where to go when he tempts you. We are not free to do whatever we want. Liberty and license are not synonyms. We don't have license now to go do whatever we want. In that freedom, we are now free to love God and love one another, free to keep the Ten Commandments without a sense of obligation or a sense of we're saving ourselves, free to keep them because our neighbor needs us to, and we want to, because we love God and because we care about our neighbor as well. So the freedom of the gospel does correlate into the Christian life. But it is a beautiful thing. Justification is a two-sided coin. One side is the forgiveness of sins. The other side is the freedom of the gospel, and you have that, and I hope you enjoy it. You do not have to give things up during Lent, and if you do, I hope you are successful. Like I offered last week, if you want an accountability partner, that's what we pastors are good for. And I will do that confidentially and lovingly and encouragingly for you. You know, many people fail on these, just like New Year's resolutions. They fail on these things. You know what? It doesn't change the fact that you're a dearly loved child of God. And I'd just be there to encourage you one way or the other. Well, that's it for Mondays at Mount Olive for today, March 10th, Lent 1. I hope you all have a blessed week. Enjoy the wonderful weather. God's blessing.